with you.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good late morning. Thank you very much for having me here today. I think I'd actually like to start by expressing my dislike for the term social media. And the reason for that is social media doesn't explain to me the full phenomenon that we're dealing with. It doesn't explain to me how people in Africa who don't have access to bank accounts are accessing them over their phones. It doesn't explain to me how women in Saudi Arabia are running call centers off of their cell phones from their homes. And so to me, it's a very limiting term. The term that I think is more appropriate is connection technologies. That is tools that connect individuals to information, which is what we've typically called new media, to each other and entities, which is what we've typically called social media. But the third part is what I think is most important, which is how technology is basically functioning as a tool to connect people to actual resources, be they financial, be they judicial, be they educational as in distance learning, be they health as in telemedicines. And so I think it's important to frame the advent of these technologies in terms of what and who they connect individuals with. Now, a second point that I want to address is why are we talking about the power of these tools today? Is there any reason that it's topical for this particular moment in time? I think that there's both statistical answers to that as well as answers that lie in the characteristics of what's actually distinct about these tools. So if you just look at the facts and figures, let's take the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, the number of people who have access to handsets or mobile phones has risen from 907 million to over 5 billion, which is pretty significant growth. Take a country like Pakistan, 165 million people, give or take. Nobody would dispute that it's a huge international priority. The number of handsets in Pakistan in the last 10 years has grown from 300,000 to 100 million. So just imagine how intense and serious that growth is in just this one particular country. With internet, it's the same story. The number of people that are online now as opposed to 10 years ago has risen from roughly 361 million to more than 2 billion users. So technology is inevitable. And part of the reason that the spread of technology is inevitable is there's no shortage of companies that are actually developing these tools and pushing them out onto the public domain. But part of the reason behind the inevitability is that human beings by nature are addicted to technology, even if it actually seems counterintuitive to their privacy, even if it seems counterintuitive to their safety. Human beings just can't resist the urge to play with the newest toys. It's just the reality of who we are as individuals. Now let me talk about why these tools are distinct. I would argue that connection technologies, which I think are best embodied by handsets, are probably the most, out of any technology we've seen, they're doing more to foster individual empowerment than any technology in history. Now, somebody could argue that, well, this is just a generational thing, and every single generation has their technology that empowers, and so the notion of tools empowering citizens isn't actually anything new. Except it is in this case. If you look back initially at the printing press, and then the radio, and the landline, and the satellite television, and all these other tools throughout history, they all have one thing in common, which is they require intermediaries. So somebody had to own the printing press, somebody had to own the TV station. You needed substantial money and resources to generate content. But connection technologies today require any individual to own, develop, and disseminate their own content at a cost that is appropriate to everybody from a nomadic citizen to the wealthiest members of society. And so the citizens that we see today are the most individually empowered we've ever seen in history. So where does that matter? I would argue, let me sort of explain this in a social context, and then I'll explain it in an economic context. And just because I always find stories to be more interesting, let me start with an anecdote. I spent a big amount of time in 2004 and 2005 living in the Islamic Republic of Iran, conducting research on youth and dynamics in the country. Now, when I initially went to Iran, a country of 67 million people, for which a country of 70 million people, for which 67% are under the age of 30, I wasn't thinking about technology at all. And then I found myself in a very busy marketplace in the southern Iranian city of Shiraz, And I noticed something very strange, which is this one intersection of about 4 or 5 different alleyways with no less than about 20 to 25 young teenagers or kids in their early 20s tapping away at their cell phones, which wasn't something unusual to see in a country where 60% of the population have handsets. But what was unusual is they were all tapping away at their cell phones perched against shops and different walls and not interacting with each other. So I asked one of them, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm using Bluetooth." Now, I had always thought about Bluetooth as that creepy device where you walk around talking to yourself. And how many of you, by show of hands, think of Bluetooth as that creepy device where you walk around talking to yourself? I'll raise my hand.
I do.
And what was interesting is I asked them what they were doing, and they explained to me how they were using Bluetooth to call and text complete strangers. And I asked them what they meant. And one of them was trying to recruit a bassist for his band. Another one was trying to get people involved in an underground book club. They were doing largely social and recreational organizing using a tool that I had always thought was most useful for people being able to talk and drive at the same time. And so I asked them all, I said, a lot of what you're doing here, is risky in terms of getting caught. Aren't you worried about somebody catching you? And they had all sort of crowded around at this point and said, nobody over the age of 30 knows what Bluetooth is. And I thought this really summed up a generation gap that existed. But what was more interesting is when I came back to the United States, and I talked to Motorola, and I talked to IBM, and I talked to all of these companies that had been at the forefront of Bluetooth technology. While they understood the technological feasibility of how this could happen, none of them could imagine in their wildest dreams why anybody would want to use Bluetooth for this. And so the reason I tell you this somewhat long-winded story is because of what I describe as an innovation gap, which means that engineers in one type of society develop tools to solve for a particular set of problems. In this case, how do you talk and drive at the same time? How do you carry groceries and talk at the same time? But what happens is those engineers develop technologies that for commercial purposes begin to spread around the world. And there's a difference between those that innovate the products to solve for the problems and those that use those products in innovative and new uses and new ways to solve for a completely different set of problems. And this is what I describe as an innovation gap. So translate this into economic terms. This can obviously be translated into political and social terms, but since this is a conference focused largely on business, what to me is particularly powerful about the tools that we see today is anybody has the opportunity and the space to scale what they're doing. And I would argue that the places where the largest amount of innovation will take place in terms of how these tools are used most effectively are not in the societies where a lot of the tools are actually built, but they're in the countries and the regions of the world where the combination of necessity and diverse challenge mixed with the sudden influx of these tools will lead to some of the most unbelievable creativity in terms of how any individual can develop a new model for something that's scalable, how rural populations can come up with creative ways to get access to urban markets, to come up with interesting and creative ways to do distance learning and financial inclusion, mobile banking, and so forth. And so I leave you with this thought around technology, because I've gone a little bit over my allocated initial remarks, which is that the technology is inevitable. The technology is the most individually empowering set of tools we've ever seen in our lifetime. It connects people to information, each other, and actual resources. And because of this innovation gap that exists, the spread of these billions and billions of handsets really will make the 21st century all about surprises. And I leave you with that thought.
Thank you very much.